If you read the report called Climate Control by the House Judiciary Committee, you will find that Mark Carney is mentioned 7 times in that report. He's one of the few people mentioned by name. And basically, he's the point man on net zero, right? He's the guy who came up with this whole idea of net zero. And so, people noticed in the news that banks were walking away from the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Asset managers were leaving the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero. And people thought, oh, well, they're doing that because of Trump. No, they're doing that because they don't want to go to jail and be fined hundreds of millions of dollars for antitrust violations.
The lovely Michelle Stirling, back again. I've been thinking about you for the last few days. As soon as the election results came in Canada, you were the first person that came to mind. I was like, I got to talk to Michelle. Our last episode that we did together has been shared tens of thousands of times. I don't know what the view count is on it, but it went super mega around the world and back. So right away, I was like, I got to talk to Michelle because I think you're the only one that can really kind of put things in perspective for us. So I guess let's just start by asking, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm okay because I decided that it is what it is and we're just going to have to deal with it. The fact that, many people wanted to have a conservative majority and flip the script in Canada to be something a bit more grounded, rational, common sense. It's very disappointing for all of us who thought that way to see Mr. Carney sort of parachuted in with his wife, who we, never got to know at all, who kept introducing him and saying, well, you've all been learning something about my husband, Mark Carney, the past few weeks. And it's kind of like, well, shouldn't we have known something about him before and also about you, madam? So, there are some ironies that, kind of give me hope in an odd kind of way. And one of them that I just mentioned to you is that the day Mr. Net Zero Carney was elected as Prime Minister of Canada, Spain and Portugal had reached 100% renewable energy just a couple of days ago. But on the day that he was elected, Net Zero Spain and Portugal came early there. It came early to net zero because they had national blackouts.
Yeah, so a bit of foreshadowing.
That's what net zero brings you, people. Blackouts.
Yeah.
So they were very lucky they could get the system back up and running in relatively short order, but it was totally chaotic. And, people had no idea what was going on. Like when you have a blackout here, it occasionally happens. If a tree falls on a line, it's usually regional, a very small part of the city or maybe some block of the province, but they usually get it back up in a couple of hours. And people know, and because you can check your cell phone. Well, all the cell phone towers went dead. So people had no communication. They had no money. The ATMs didn't work. So they think of that in a world where Mr. Carney himself is proposing a digital currency. If the power goes down, then you have no money at all. So some of the lucky people in Spain and Portugal did have some cash on them. And so there's quite a few tweets on X saying, I learned my lesson. You should have a small flashlight with you, carry small bills, because if the ATM network goes down, you can at least, if you want to buy a juice or something, you can do that transaction at a store. But if you only have a 50 on you, then that can of juice is going to cost you $50 because they won't be able to make change, right? And be prepared that it might not, you might not have power for more than a day. So do you have food? Do you have any food on you? Maybe a couple of protein snacks in your backpack if you're out and about. everything stops. There's no water. That's one blog I read this morning. The couple in Spain had a brand new induction stove, right? Can't heat the house, can't cook anything because it's electric. So, the risks of decarbonization, the very path that Mr. Carney wants all of Canada and all of the world to go down, are very well shown by this sad example in Spain and Portugal, where by going to decarbonization, they also went to blackout.
You raise a really good point, because so yesterday in my small Alberta town, we had a bit of a blackout here because of a thunderstorm. And I think the lightning hit one of our transformers and fried it. So part of the town was without power for like a couple hours. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But, you multiply that by days on end, and, not being able to go into an ATM or not being able to tap your debit card or your credit card, like going really back to the fundamental basics. And that's really what net zero has in store for us, because we don't have the technology necessary to provide clean, quote unquote, renewable energy to millions of people perpetually. Right.
Right. Yeah, and the more renewables you add to the grid, if you don't have equivalent backup that's conventional, then you risk going to blackout. That's what happened in Spain. And excuse me, what's happening in Europe is that they've created a very interconnected grid through all of Europe. And a number of engineers have been warning now for years, like this could be a catastrophe, because each country is hoping that the country next door will have extra power when they need it. But, most weather patterns are regional. So if you don't have wind in France, you won't have wind in Germany. If you don't have wind in the UK, you won't have wind in Norway. So, and recently, actually, Norway has asked to be disconnected from the European grid, because they have very reliable hydro. They have lots and lots of hydropower. So they've been kind of the massive battery, if you like, for all of Europe. But what this means is that when there's no wind in Germany and France and, Holland, whatever, Denmark, then they all start drawing from whoever has that power. And that means that the prices in Norway went through the roof, and their electricity prices should be and normally are quite low. But when this demand goes up, then the price goes up for Norwegians. And they're kind of like, wait a minute, why are we bearing the burden, excuse me, for all of our neighbors? We've done this as a goodwill project, to decarbonize, to, help save the planet. And now we're paying this price. So I think that's a lesson for Canada, because one of the main projects that Mr. Carney has said he wants to build is an east-west power grid. This has been the plan of the Liberal Party since around 2005. And the original idea of it is that we could build a grid east-west. We would connect to all the hydropower in Quebec and down east in the Maritimes and in BC and some in Manitoba. And then by linking all these clean energy superpowers together, we would have a great clean energy grid, a national grid. And part of the thinking there was that Alberta would supply about 30% of the wind power. So you can imagine Alberta would look like a hedgehog, and, all of our beautiful views would be gone, and the price of our power would be through the roof. But worst of all, aside from the fact that an east-west grid is not economical at all, because there are huge, vast distances where there's nobody. So you're paying for these high voltage distribution transmission lines that cost a fortune to build out. But, there's no substations there to serve anybody. Mm-hmm. So it would be catastrophically expensive, not economical, but also, as we see in Spain and Portugal, put us at risk of a national blackout. Because the way the grids are structured now, they primarily are powered and designed to serve the needs of that province with some interconnectors. So, for example, Quebec right now is actually tapped out in terms of provision of power, despite the fact that they have that enormous James Bay Dam. They're all subscribed. They have big contracts with the United States. They have decreed that houses should be heated with electricity. They don't allow wood heating anymore. So they've added all this electrical heating in big cities like Montreal. In winter, they're actually drawing on the natural gas power energy from Ontario. so you can imagine that this kind of idea of the east-west grid, even though for climate ideologues they think it sounds better than a pipeline, it's actually potentially catastrophic. And another point that someone brought up to me recently is that, when you build a pipeline, in general, they're built under the ground or in protected regions where, there's very few people. The lines are all cleared back. There's always a right-of-way that's cleared way back of trees and everything else. So the potential for any damage to the pipeline is low, very low. It can happen. It does happen from time to time, but it's very low. But for electrical grids, with all these big hydro lines, you can see that when there's an ice storm or a big storm, sometimes those big transmission towers will fall right down from the weight. So there's a huge ongoing cost of maintenance for these kinds of transmission lines and electrical facilities. That doesn't mean we shouldn't build what we need to serve ourselves. Obviously, we need them and use them, but we shouldn't pretend that it's better than a pipeline, because the pipeline will bring you energy with almost no maintenance versus the cost of these hydro lines that need constant maintenance and that are always subject to extreme weather events.
Right. And, so I saw on X the other day, actually, that perhaps this was at the same time when Portugal and Spain experienced their blackouts, but there was almost a continent-wide blackout in Europe. And their grid hit near zero.
Yeah,
and
we were that close.
That close, right? So that's an entire continent without power. And that's a horrifying prospect. And to think that could happen here in Canada. And then you think of other factors like ecotourism. What if, for whatever reason, aggressive, climate groups decide that the east-west grid is polluting or hazardous to the environment, and they decide to take one of the many stations across Canada offline. That could put us all in the dark for God knows how long. And the additional thing about pipelines is that they're very basic in terms of you move the energy from one place to another. So if there is some sort of disaster or some sort of blackout or something, the energy is still going to move through those lines. Whereas in this scenario, one of those stations goes down and that's it. Like, we're all in the dark until they figure it out, right?
Yeah, it would probably be more than one station, but yes, that is the potential. And the other thing that people don't realize, when people are saying, well, let's build a high voltage transmission line across Canada rather than a pipeline, electricity is not really an exportable product except locally or regionally. So that's why we do have north-south connectors. BC buys from California, Alberta buys from Montana. I think Manitoba, I think, picks up some from North Dakota. I'm not too sure there. And Ontario and Quebec both export and import from the northern states, and a lot of energy. So, but they do that in a regional basis because that's, the farther the electricity has to travel, the more line losses you have. But when you have pipelines, you have a product that, first of all, it becomes portable and exportable at the other end. So you can put it into a barrel and ship it as it is. You can refine it and turn it into all kinds of different products. Some of them will be like jet fuel, and some of them will be the byproducts. It's really weird that, the Cape Doctors, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, they're now advocating that we shouldn't teach children in school about energy literacy. And to me, one of the more fundamental things of Canada's past decade is that people are so energy illiterate. They don't understand how the power grid works, and they don't understand that there's a big difference between an EV and an ICE car, an internal combustion engine car. They see them as the same thing when they're not. So, we should be teaching children in school about how our energy system works. And these Cape Doctors are not only trying to not teach children in school, they say it's called polluting education. That's their report.
Fuck.
I mean, just imagine, what kind of medical system do we have without the byproducts of oil, natural gas, and coal? I mean, these guys are basically advocating for putting us all back on the kitchen table for surgery. It's ludicrous. So again, going back to the point of whether we have east-west power grid or whether we have a pipeline, in the pipeline, you can also transport different types of oil, gas products. They have a system for changing out these different products, and you can supply millions of people just with one pipeline. Whereas with a high voltage transmission line, at every place you have to have step down transformers and substations so that the power that gets to the house is at the right hertz for the house, rather than high voltage. It's household voltage, household current. So that seems to be one of the big projects that Mr. Carney wants to build. And if you notice, there are all kinds of ENGOs now advocating for this very same thing. And that brings us back to what I talked about with you before, the climate cartel. Mm-hmm. So for people who hadn't listened to our earlier conversation, the climate cartel has been identified by the House Judiciary Committee on Antitrust Violations in the U.S. as potentially violating the antitrust rulings there, because it's a large connection of net zero obsessed asset managers, banks, and other investment groups like As You Sow. So these groups are pressure groups. They will get a small share in a company. Mm-hmm. Then they will start making shareholder proposals. They will engage with the company. They'll sit down with the company and say, we want you to reach net zero. So for instance, if you're an airline, and remember, they're your shareholders. They come to you and they say, we want you to reduce demand for your services. Really, isn't the point of running a business to increase demand and serve your customers better? But in demand management, and this is outlined in the climate control report of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, they say that they're telling people who run aviation companies, you should tell your customers, if it's a short-haul flight, you have to take high-speed rail instead. We're going to remove your frequent flyer benefits, and so you don't have those rewards anymore. Basically, the whole idea is to make flying more miserable and to try and maintain the same use of jet fuel as there was in 2019. So, and these people are working together, and they work with front groups as proxies, like all these environmental groups. So when you look at this east-west pipeline in Canada, and suddenly all the environmental groups popping up, 350.org, send a letter to your MP, demand an east-west power grid. Then you go, and I think also there was a letter from all the mayors in, what was it? 11 mayors or more, including the mayor of Jasper, also advocating for an east-west power grid. Well, that's not going to put out the fire in Jasper. That's
Yeah.
ludicrous. But they tie it to these events. Anyway, it's the same kind of practices as the climate cartel in the United States. And if you read the report called Climate Control by the House Judiciary Committee, you will find that Mark Carney is mentioned 7 times in that report. He's one of the few people mentioned by name. And basically, he's the point man on net zero, right? He's the guy who came up with this whole idea of net zero. And so, people noticed in the news that banks were walking away from the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Asset managers were leaving the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero. And people thought, oh, well, they're doing that because of Trump. No, they're doing that because they don't want to go to jail and be fined hundreds of millions of dollars for antitrust violations. Like, the penalties for antitrust violations in the States are very severe. And you would think somebody, with the business acumen and global experience of Mr. Carney would be aware of antitrust legislation in the States, because it's been used in a number of very high-profile cases down there. So it's not like it's a secret. It's very well known in the business community, and they take it really seriously. So, So Canada's going to have some, how shall we say, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah.
A Chinese curse.
Yeah. Well, something I want to point out for our American listeners and Canadians, you may not be aware, but there was a devastating wildfire in Jasper last year.
Mm-hmm.
And the fire that devastated Maui was started by a downed power line. And we're talking about running high voltage power lines across the country filled with trees and forests that haven't been maintained or managed by our federal government properly. So we're talking millions of acres of dead trees just waiting to ignite, and running high voltage power lines through them. One down line and poof, there it is. It's gone. Now, while we're on this subject of this antitrust investigation, do you know where the House Judiciary Committee is currently at on it? Have they come to a ruling or anything yet?
No, they haven't. I think they're still investigating, but they've gone through millions of documents. They've had all kinds of people testify in person, including Mr. Carney. There is a transcript of his testimony on their website. And and one of the key things that they say is that it doesn't matter, what kind of social justification you have for doing this, meaning like we're going to save the planet. It still doesn't mean you can break this law. So, and really, when you look at it, that's what's been happening a lot in Canada and around the world with all these sort of self-righteous climate ideologues who believe that it's their right to go and sit in an airport and glue themselves to the floor, or glue themselves to a plane, or to the runway, or to the roadway, and impede other people's ordinary business, legal business. They believe that it is their right to break the law, that it's their obligation to break the law, that this is their social justification. They're saving the planet. But as the House Judiciary Committee points out in their report, you're still breaking the law. So no, you don't get a pass. But in Canada, we have given people a pass for that. We have said, oh, well, if Tzipora Berman and her friends are blocking logging in BC, she's saving the planet, and, we'll take her into custody, we'll write up a report about it, but we'll let her go free, and then she can go back with all of her friends and block more logging or block oil sands activity. Or like the Greenpeace group that rappelled off the Calgary Tower a few years ago in the court sessions. One of them was from France. He came all the way here to bother us in Canada. And the lawyer for him said, well, please don't give him a criminal charge because he wants to be a lawyer. Well, so what? We had to put up with shutting down all of our city, downtown core. and, hoping and praying that nothing happened to the people hanging off the tower, not to mention all the citizens below.
Yeah.
And then be exploited, have that image of their big banner exploited around the world to denigrate our industry in Canada. And now you're begging for mercy because you want to be a lawyer when you grow up. Like, I'm sorry, I would say straight to the slammer.
Yeah. And in less eloquent wording, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, pretty direct.
So now that we've entered into Carney territory, I wanted to ask you, the main reason I wanted to talk to you is because, our deep dive into Carney and the climate cartel, I've re-listened to that episode probably 5 to 10 times. I fast forward through myself because I can't listen to myself speak, but you provided just an onslaught of important information in that episode that we did together. And now that we're here, Mark Carney is our elected prime minister, leading a minority liberal government in Canada. The main question I wanted to ask you is, in your estimation, what can we expect to see from this government in the near and distant future?
Well, my view is that he was brought in to enact Article 6 of the Paris Accord, which concerns international carbon trading. And I think some people may have heard Daniel Smith mention it in the past. Premier Smith has mentioned it as a way to possibly offset the alleged emissions of Alberta, to facilitate, if we sell our natural gas to China or India, some coal using country, then haven't we reduced their emissions of coal? Because coal has a higher CO2 emissions content. But these rules were never formalized, but they were formalized at COP29. COP29 in Azerbaijan happened just a few days after Trump was elected. And so they finally got the rules all together for how to implement it. And boom, what happened? Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So the whole purpose of the Paris Agreement, these are from the Nature Conservancy, so they're online if people want to read more detail about it. This is Article 6 explainer, but one of the things they say right off the top is that the Paris Agreement paved the way for a new era of carbon trading. So, it wasn't for saving the planet. It's for carbon trading. And if you go on the Canadian government website and look for nature-based climate solutions, you'll find a page that has all kinds of images of wetlands, forests, oceans, and waterways, permafrost, I don't know. So the whole idea is that Canada will be turned into a giant carbon trading park. So what big companies with large emissions will do, because there is no technology that would allow them to meet net zero at this time, they will be forced to buy carbon credits, carbon offsets, and Canada will be offering them to the world. So I think that is the principal reason as to why Mr. Carney was rather parachuted into this position in Canada, because then he's in a position to enact this. And ironically, people maybe remember that he first went to France to visit President Macron, and then he went to see the King. Well, the King happens to have a sustainability platform, and he wrote up a thing called Terra Carta, which is kind of a takeoff on the Magna Carta, but it's giving rights to nature. In fact, giving more rights to nature than for people. So it is a sustainability platform, and how coincidental that we now have someone whose former company, Goldman Sachs, has made a killing on carbon trading, now in a position to animate King Charles' Terra Carta and to bring in Article 6. And in my view, they're in a rush to make this happen. I mean, they fiddled around trying to make the rules for the past 9 years, but they're now in a rush to make it happen because Trump is completely dismantling the climate cult in the States. He's just taken a wrecking ball to everything. He's like the Grim Reaper. He's just going through the climate forest, cutting down all the things that they've grown and built over the past 20, 30 years. So if they don't get it rolling soon, it probably won't happen.
Okay, so what does this policy, what threat does it pose to everyday people?
Well, I would say that, first of all, it restricts the development of resources in Canada, because if you look on our website for Friends of Science Society, we've got a couple of reports that Robert Lyman did on the biodiversity crisis. So, there's all these crises in the world. There's a climate crisis, and, crisis of, what do they call it? The poly crisis going on, the health crisis related to COVID, and now the biodiversity crisis. So they keep attaching crisis to the end of it, so people think it's urgent and we must do it.
Right.
So part of the biodiversity crisis is the desire or demand to block off at least 30% of the natural areas of Canada.
Yeah.
So when they say block it off, that means that you won't be able to do any resource development. And when you look at some of these areas, some of them are called Indigenous protected areas and some are just conservation areas. When you look at them, they just kind of happen to coincide with where there's critical minerals, or where you might want to put one of those energy corridors, and, then all of a sudden you can't do it. And there's also been a group out of the States, not only this group, but one in particular, Pew charitable trusts, have been funding, I think they're permanent Indigenous protected areas. I think that's what they're called, up north. And it's amazing, like huge tracts of land have been blocked off. They've pumped millions of dollars into this. I don't know who that money has gone to. I don't know whose pockets it's enriched. But they've been doing this since 1990. But these big tracts of land, curiously, seem to be right where you might want to put a deep water port, for instance. So some people would argue, well, it's very nice that big philanthropies like the Pew Trusts or the Oak Foundation or Climate Works or any of these groups, it's very nice that they want to help us protect our nature. Like, what's wrong with that? So what if they're throwing $15 million into Nunavut to protect some area, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Is there any oversight on that from federal government? I mean, did we invite them to do that? Is that not some kind of foreign interference? And what do these people hope to gain from it? Are they just so philanthropic that they have several $1 million that they can throw at people they don't even know in another country and kiss it goodbye, and they don't expect anything in return? That seems very far-fetched to me.
Yeah, it does. And so what part does Mark Carney have in all this? Where is he in this Article 6 Agenda 2030 plan that seems to be unfolding in front of us? See, I want to throw this in here because I wrote about this yesterday and I've been thinking about it quite a lot. What Mark Carney seems to me is, and I've phrased it this way before, and I think this is the best way that I can articulate it, but he seems to be a globalist javelin that they're just taught, like he is the last line of defense, and they're throwing him in there in Donald Trump's direction because he has a number of connections to the Trump family. He's as Brookfield's man in charge. He spread billions of dollars all over the world in fossil fuel projects in China. Yes, Mr. Net Zero is deeply invested in Chinese extremely dirty fossil fuels, renewable energy projects in the West. He's like the ultimate net zero Agenda 2030 globalist. And he looks like he's, you know, the bishop that they've put into place to block Trump's king. That's what it looks like to me. And I'm not one of these guys who thinks Trump's like this brilliant political strategist. He has his flaws. But I think that with the United States, which was the global leader in net zero and all of these, you know, trending scams, global scams, now pulling out, I think what Mark Carney appears to be is the last line of defense for these, you know, World Economic Forum, GFANs, name your NGO here, parasites. Do you see this the same way? Like where is he in all this?
Well, first of all, I would say that I wouldn't look at the U.S. as a leader in this, but I would say that they are a promoter of it, and not as a country, but as the philanthropic groups within the country that formed Climate Works. And so I would say leaders in achieving net zero or striving to achieve net zero would be the UK and Germany, both of whom are on the edge of economic disaster because of these policies, because they're paying a fortune for all the renewable energy that they've built in. Electricity prices in the UK are now the highest in the world, so that's driven off investment. In Germany, they used to rely on oil and gas from Russia at a reasonable rate, and so their industry thrived. That's been cut off by the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So now, they're importing LNG from, and also the UK is importing LNG from Qatar, which ties them to a terrorist state. And also they import, in Germany, they import LNG from the United States, but it's probably 4 or 5 times the market price in the rest of the world. And they're now highly dependent on other nations. They don't have that supply themselves. And, even if they had kept all their coal plants going, they'd be in a better situation. They do have some coal plants there, and they do still have some lignite coal there. But with coal, for instance, you can order a year's supply of coal and, just dump it on the ground there somewhere and use it, and you don't have, it's not like with liquefied natural gas where that gas, as it's being used, it's gone. You can't have a huge supply on hand. In the same way that you can with coal. And you also need very expensive infrastructure. So anyway, my point is that these two countries have followed the net zero pathway, and they are deindustrializing and experiencing degrowth. I think that the whole idea of net zero and this Article 6 carbon trading was intended that somehow it would become an equalization formula where these countries could get money back from countries that are rich in fossil fuels or from companies that use a lot of fossil fuels. So I think that that's also kind of an essential puzzle piece in this international carbon trading, because it's intended to rebalance the fact that some places in the world are rich in fossil fuels and some are not. And I was just reading this morning, and can't remember what it was, but how there is an impetus from certain groups in the world that want to globalize commodities, important commodities, like, for instance, the oil sands. Like, why should Alberta have the oil sands? It was just luck that we had hardy pioneers who came out here, made treaties with the native people, and along the way, some clever entrepreneurs figured out how to get the oil out of the sand in a fairly economical way. And voila, we now have 50% of the oil in the free world in Alberta. Well, there's a bit down east, but most of it's in Alberta. So, and it's worth about $21 trillion at market value. So that, Why should Alberta have those riches? I mean, we're only 4 or 5 million people here. So this is how the rest of the world is looking at us now and say, why don't we globalize that? You know,
Mm.
everyone should have access to these commodities, and there should be some global power that, like mom and dad at home, that says, okay, kids, here's your candy and your candy and your candy, and I will maintain the bag of candy and I will dole it out as I see fit.
Socialism.
Yeah, or even, I don't think it's even beyond that, but yeah, okay. So we've heard Mr. Carney say a few times that he doesn't want to have 13 economies in Canada when there can be one economy. So that says to me, well, maybe somebody's thinking about nationalizing the oil sands and other resources, because that would, take away the provincial ownership of these resources, which is, that's quite a unique thing in Alberta. We own the natural resources in Alberta. It's in the Constitution, so we own it. But other people around the world would look at those riches, and other people in Canada look at them and say, well, why don't we all own it? And you see that often on tweets where people, where someone says, the Alberta oil sands, they say, no, you mean the Canadian oil sands. No, it's Alberta. It's ours.
Yeah. And so communism, let's just go there, because
that's it. Yeah, that's communism. Yeah,
exactly. So now, Article 6, what does Mark Carney and Brookfield Asset Management have to do with this? Let's just say this: Mark Carney's former asset management firm, right? Because he's technically not supposed to still be working with Brookfield, but I've made this comparison many times, so apologies to people who've heard it, but Mark Carney's relationship to Brookfield is I would imagine as disconnected as Dick Cheney's relationship to Halliburton was during the Iraq War. So what do Mark Carney and Brookfield Asset Management stand to gain from this Article 6 carbon trading network?
Well, I can't say that I've studied specifically Brookfield's role here. But I would say that it is very interesting that there's a UNPRI session where Mark Carney is thanking the People's Bank of China for coming up with the framework for green finance. And Andy Lee on X has found the documents for this Chinese green finance. So, when you look at greening the economy, the country that benefits most from that is China. This is where most of the wind turbines come from, the solar panels. They're made in poor environmental conditions. We would never allow it to happen in that way here in North America or in Europe, because our environmental standards are very high. But that's the country that gains the most. And years ago, I found PowerPoint by the Baker McKenzie law firm, and part of it showed that there was a thing called the Clean Device Mechanism, which was a forerunner to the Article 6 carbon trading agreement. And it was the World Bank and a private fund made $1.2 billion in 23 minutes trading through this Clean Device Mechanism on pollution from plants in China. So, there's obviously some obscure financial realm that we ordinary mortals are below, that we don't understand, that it's at a very high level platform in the markets that we're not able to access, but effectively we end up paying for it, because any of these kinds of impositions, if you're asking a company that's making steel to produce steel with electricity instead of the present thermal processes that they use, and then you're forcing them to buy carbon offsets, ultimately that will be draining your pocket as a consumer, because all those costs will be passed on to you. And Mr. Carney's promises during the election campaign were that he was going to really tax big companies, and then they would pay you. Like, I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah, no, and I actually wanted to get to that. You know what? This whole, for people listening, I'm sorry, because we are currently recording this a few days after the Canadian election, and I'm still stunned by the outcome. I don't know if Mark Carney won as much as Pierre Poilievre lost, but I can't believe we're here. Like, just with my podcast alone, the 3 or 4 episodes that I did where we zeroed in on Mark Carney's past, his history with GFANs as the UN climate czar, particularly my episode with you, because that one just took off. I thought that people just, maybe I'm just making poor assumptions here, but I had assumed that people knew enough that they wouldn't make this decision, And again, I'm not like one of these guys who thinks Pierre Poilievre was like the end all be all to these problems, but it was a return to baseline essentially that we were looking for in Canada. Like we're not asking for much. We just want to live normal lives again. But yet here we are now. And I just don't know, like leftist Canadians, which just so happens to be over 50% of our country, they seem to just have this desire to self-destruct, because there's nothing in anything Mark Carney has ever presented that seems beneficial to humanity in any way to me, outside of a handful of members of the elite class, right? And I guess that's where I'm going here, because I get the sense that, once Article 6 is enacted and these carbon trades, move forward, it just feels like most of us are going to be pushed into subjugation just under the tax burden of all this, right? Because all of these companies, as you mentioned, they're going to pass the costs on to the consumer. It's not like we just get away with this. It's not like the companies are just going to go, okay, well, we're going to decrease our razor thin margins in order to cover the costs. No, we're all going to pay for it. So life is about to get a lot more expensive for Canadians, and most of us are already barely treading water. Everybody I talk to, every person in my community, every person I talk to back home in Vancouver, every person I talk to across this country, I'm fortunate because I have this podcast. I have a lot of people reach out to me, and I get to speak to lovely people like Michelle Stirling on the podcast. Everybody that I talk to privately tells me I'm barely making it. I'm barely getting through. That is the general circumstance for most Canadians right now. So if life gets even more expensive for us, it really does feel, and again, I'm sorry, listeners, I know I'm going down this road that I've been down a number of times, and I really don't want to lose you here, but this feels like neo-feudalism to me.
Well, Joel Kotkin wrote a book on that, The Coming Neo-Feudalism, and the model that he referred to was California. And, if you look at California, it has all these different kinds of climate policies that are cratering that state to the point where some people actually see California's policy as an actual risk to the security of the United States. California, interestingly enough, has a carbon trading deal with Quebec. Quebec never had a carbon tax. They had a carbon trading deal with California. So, and Ontario did at one point too. And if you remember, when Doug Ford came in, he canceled that. Now there's a lawsuit by a group of young people led by Sophia Matter, and it's sponsored by EcoJustice. And her mom's a longtime activist. Her mom was on the board with Greta Thunberg of We Don't Have Time out of Sweden, which is a big carbon trading group as well. But anyway, so the plan was to get all of Canada into trading, carbon trading. But of course, Doug Ford canceled it for Ontario, and then these kids took out a lawsuit against him, and it's still ongoing. They're fighting under the charter right to life and liberty. So, I mean, life without fossil fuels means we're all dead. But I
Right.
suspect now that Guilbeault managed to get the cap on emissions in Alberta, Carney will not remove it because the cap is essential to forcing cap and trade. You have the cap, then in order to continue to do business or grow your business, you have to engage in trade. So you can see how they very carefully over the years set these up. It goes back to about 2008, where a large group of philanthropies, most of them in the United States, formed a group called Climate Works. And they've been spending at least $600 million a year funding ENGOs, funding academics, and funding alternative journalism to try and push their dream of a decarbonized world. And most of those ENGOs were charities. And they've been funding charities in Canada too, this same group. And I just want to give you a bit of background here. People are saying, well, Pierre Poilievre lost because he didn't do this, he didn't say that, he didn't, aggressively deal with Trump in any way. But in fact, behind the scenes, there's this huge ENGO network in Canada that's really super well funded. They have lots of foot soldiers. And if you can believe it, according to the National Observer on March 14th, they said another clear indication Carney was concerned about potential backlash from the climate movement is that the morning of his swearing in as prime minister, he met with leaders from environmental NGOs to outline his vision for climate. So can you imagine? Let's just flip that and say that he met with leading proponents of the oil and gas industry,
Yeah.
mining industry, or the logging industry, or agriculture, farmers. Just flip that and think what the media would say if they heard that the prime minister, before he was sworn in, met with a certain group, to outline his vision for their sector.
Yeah. Well,
They'd go berserk, they'd go through the roof. But if we look at what's happened over the years, this is from one of our reports from 2019, just about the revenues that these ENGOs have. The revenues received by the ENGOs and their enviro law counterparts over the period of 2000 to 2018 was over 18 times the revenues received by all federal political parties, and over 27 times the revenues received by market-oriented institutes. That would be like the Fraser Institute, Frontier, Macdonald-Laurier. Both Ducks Unlimited Canada and the Nature Conservancy Canada annually receive higher revenues than all the major federal political parties. A large portion of funding to these organizations is from the federal government. And I just put up a post on my Substack, which is about the residential school issue and this nature-based climate solutions. So there is a correlation there, I think. But anyway, when you look at what I posted there, I put up an excerpt from the CRA for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Their last reporting period, they received government funding of $82 million, which
oh my God.
is 40.83% of their revenue.
So, okay, just pause there for a sec. What the fuck?
Yeah.
See, this is worse to me than Carney meeting with industry leaders, because at least industry leaders have these are industry leaders. These are executives. They have a certain, I don't know the word that I'm looking for here, because I'm lost on that 80 million number. But
82.
The point is that these are professionals in the private sector. They have a certain way that they move and the way that they behave, that they know what their limits and their restrictions are. This is Carney meeting with fucking activists.
Yeah, that's right.
right? Like these are activists. These aren't people from the private sector. These aren't. These are professional complainers,
That's
and
right. And
and we gave them 80 million. Okay, sorry, Michelle. Before you continue, do we know where okay, for people listening, 80 million is the disclosed amount. Okay, we're not talking about undisclosed sums, because these charities or these activist foundations tend to receive undisclosed sums of money from other donors and benefactors and things like that. Now, do we know where the other 60% of their funding came from, Michelle?
well, here, according to the CRA, it says that receipted donations were 45 million, which is about 22%. So, that would be people writing a check, maybe buying some, paying for trees in memorial for a loved one. Non-receipted donations are 10 million, or about 4%. Gifts from other charities are 24 million, or about 12%. And other revenues are 39 million, or about 19%. So obviously the government funding of 82 million, which is 43%, is the largest chunk of their revenue. And there is another, off the top of my head, I can speak about it. There's another charity called the Canadian Climate Institute, which is frequently cited in news reports as supporting this or that policy that, the government is kind of proposing in the background. And then the news report says, and the Canadian Climate Institute has issued a report confirming that this is a great idea. Of course, they were funded 96% by the government for the first couple of years of their existence. 96%. They had no receipted donations. There's another organization that Parker Gallant has tracked for many years called the Transition Accelerator. No receipted donations. What kind of charity is that? The whole purpose of a charity is that there's a cause that you people locally and personally care about, to the point that you will give money to that cause. So it may be, let's say, a cancer institute. Maybe you have a loved one who suffered from that disease or died from it. So you want them to have some of your money to support research or to support patient care. Maybe it's the Heart and Stroke Foundation. Maybe it's a mental health organization. Maybe it's the local bird farm, or some kind of small public reserve where you can go out and be in nature, and you want to go out there, you spend $30, you get a receipt. That's the whole idea. It's supposed to be local, tangible, and measurable. That's the principle. And there's supposed to be a net public benefit for any charity. If you look at the CRA regulations, those are the fundamentals. So these guys are dealing with climate change, which is not local, not measurable, not tangible, and they're dealing in millions of dollars of it, and it's your money. And they're drawing from the tax pool. People who are donating these receipted donations of $45 million from individuals, that's money that doesn't go into your tax pool, because those individuals get to write it off. And the whole idea of having a local charity, a food bank, where you support them with your $30, your $100 donation, your homeless shelter, you support them with your $50 donation, is the idea that you locally and the volunteers and the people who run the place are caring for local people. You know what their local needs are. Therefore, that charity serves a purpose where you don't need the high level of government to drop in and administer something. And these ENGO charities are the exact opposite. That not only is the government dropping in, it's dropping money on them, and then they're turning around and telling the government what to do. And I just want to read a bit more from that piece I was reading. The revenues recorded by the Tides organization, which has now been renamed Make Way, because they felt that their name had been smeared during the expose on the tar sands campaign. It says, and this is from 2019, the revenue received by the Tides organization alone is more than the combined revenues of Canada's two largest federal political parties, the Liberal Party of Canada and the Conservative Party of Canada, over that period. The David Suzuki Foundation's average annual revenues exceed the annual revenues of the federal New Democratic Party. Well, as of today, that wouldn't be hard to do, but back in 2019, that was quite a bit of money. And 8 ENGOs have annual revenues that exceed those of the governing Liberal Party of Canada. So just imagine you get those 8 executive directors of those ENGOs in a room with the Liberal Party. Who's got the hammer, right?
It's I'm sorry, Michelle. It's fucking baffling.
Yeah.
Right? Like essentially. So just for our listeners, charities, foundations, NGOs are notorious for being places to both hide and launder money. That's what a lot of them do, unfortunately, right? When you send your $20 to, some kid in Africa, it's not going there. So just to be clear on that. But we're talking tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Billions.
And
billions of dollars.
Look, you said there were, 43 million in personal donations, right?
Yeah, I think so. Let me just check.
Okay. 43 million. How many people do you know are writing a single check to NGOs, any of them, no matter what the cause is? I don't know a single solitary human being. So what that means is those $43 million in private donations, who are they coming from? And if you're Mark Carney, for example, and you need to move some money, that's an easy way to do it. Now, I'm not saying that Mark Carney is doing that, right? But what I'm saying is we're $82 million, you said?
$82 million, yeah.
From tax.
What I would say is that, first of all, I'd say that there are thousands of Canadians who are faithfully writing checks to places like the David Suzuki Foundation. My late mom used to do that.
Okay.
And so ever since I realized what's actually going on with the Suzuki Foundation blocking jobs and development, I was infuriated to think that my mom, who loved nature, loved watching the little birds at the feeder, was very grateful for all the beauty of life, was writing a check from her pension every month for about $30. That's a big chunk for a pensioner. So I'm sure there are millions of Canadians who are doing just that same thing. They are doing it to protect their children because they believe that climate change will damage or destroy the future for their children. And so they believe that these ENGOs are saving the planet. And, really, they're not. And they have disrupted our tax pool, emptied our tax pool. So not only are the receipted donations money that's not going into the tax pool where we normally would then disperse that money for healthcare, for education, for defense, the government, in addition, is funding a lot of them for billions of dollars. And this is happening at federal, provincial, and municipal levels. And partly what's happened also here is if somebody wants to do a resource development, in the past, if you wanted to build a pipeline or, put a road through here or build a house there or whatever, or some big project bigger than a house, then for a pipeline, you would go to the National Energy Board. And they would do a strict technical evaluation, a socioeconomic evaluation. If they found it was in the country's interests, they would approve it and the thing would be built. There would be consultations along the way, but it was really a very technical, factual, economic evaluation and no subjective baloney. Well, Eco-Justice went to war against the NEB, and they managed to, in my opinion, destroy their reputation nationally when probably most people had never even heard of the NEB. And that's why we ended up with this new impact assessment process. And most project developers, resource developers, are very gun-shy of that process because it's now very, very subjective. So you might spend $1 billion to, get all the plans drawn up, do all the surveying for your project, hire staff, get all the regulatory materials together. Sometimes the regulatory materials for these big projects. One time, a fellow told me that they had to rent a Hercules to ship the French and English documentation. I think it was for Foothills Pipeline. I'm not too sure. They had to rent a Herc to send all these documents to Ottawa. Like, that's how much work is done. You can imagine how many dozens or thousands of people are involved in these kinds of assessments. Well, now it's a very subjective assessment. So as a company, you might spend $1 billion getting all these plans and everything in place, and someone say, well, you know what? I don't think you had prior informed consent from this one little native band here by this Indigenous protected area, so I don't think you can build it. Which it's a very iffy process now. There was always clarity with the NEB. They had a very clear framework, like you have to do these things in this way, in this sequence, and they must meet these standards. If you meet it, then we probably will approve it. We might put conditions on it. We might have consultations that say, you know what, we think you should move that pipeline over here a little bit because it's bothersome to this community that it's that close to them. But in general, it was, I can't say guaranteed, but it was so clear and fair that people were willing to throw money into development. Now, if you look at the record in the past decade, we haven't had these major projects. We haven't had them coming to Canada, wanting to develop them, and we've had some of them just running away. We've had millions, billions of dollars and thousands of jobs leave Canada because the approval process is so messed up. And who did that? It's these environmental groups, right? And they're proud of it. They're very proud of it. So, ultimately this will collapse the country because we literally have a Titanic of green ENGOs with power that is far greater than any party or parties combined in the federal government of Canada. So I would say that these ENGOs love the fact, going back to our new prime minister, love the fact that a climate ideologue is now our prime minister. And they will probably throw all of their support behind him. And God help us.
Michelle, every time I talk to you, man, I want to have optimism for the future, but damn it.
Well, this is part of where we can be optimistic, because if people know this kind of thing is happening, then they can try to balance it or dismantle it. But most people don't even know this is happening. Most people don't know that Carney met with all the ENGOs before he was even sworn in, when he was elected as leader of the Liberal Party. It showed up in the National Observer. But again, just imagine if that had been a group of oil and gas experts, industry experts wanting to lobby for their sector. The other thing that I think people are not aware of is, and I may have talked about this in our past show, but Peter Drucker was a management expert and economist back in the 70s, and he wrote a book then called The Unseen Revolution, Pension Fund Socialism. And in it, he predicted that over time, the unions, pension funds, would buy up most of corporate America. And that has happened. So the other thing that people don't realize is happening is that most of these major unions are invested in green projects. So you have, CUPE has 750,000 members as a union. Unifor, which also represents media people, has 320,000 members. The Ontario Teachers Pension Plan has 343,000 members. So first of all, when you're going into an election period, any one of these unions only has to hit one button to send an email to every one of their members. And they may not, I don't know if they do, but they may not be saying vote for X or Y candidate, but they may be saying support the platform that your pension fund is invested in. Right? And a lot of these union people, ironically, you frequently find them sprinkled on the boards of these environmental groups, which again goes back to the climate control report out of the States, where They say that the asset managers are using ENGOs as their proxies. So the ENGOs bring up the topic like, we should have a national heat pump program.
Yeah.
Well, who's going to benefit from that? Brookfield, because they
Yeah.
bought a partnership with heat pump companies, right?
But remember, Mark Carney has nothing to do with Brookfield anymore. All of his assets are in a blind trust, and he is here to save Canada from Trump because he's so devoutly Canadian that he would risk everything and gamble his entire fortune on being prime minister of a failing middle power. Right? Remember?
I remember that. And I also
Yeah.
remember when we did the video about, in 2020, we did a video about Mark Carney. And first of all, we did a bit of a fact check because he was promoting carbon taxes at the time. And he'd given a very influential speech to Lloyd's of London in 2015 called Breaking the Tragedy of the Horizon. And the theory behind that speech was that climate change events and impacts will be felt very far down the road. And so we tend to pass it off rather than dealing with it in the present to try and prevent these future catastrophes. But actually, a fellow in the States named Steve Kopitz from Princeton Energy Advisors, he looked at the speech and he found that Mr. Carney had misled his audience because all the data was available publicly on government websites in the US, and many of the things that he claimed simply were not supported by the evidence, like catastrophic claims about climate and weather events. But that was a very influential turning point. So that was part of our presentation. And also in that video, he was planning to have a digital currency. He wanted to upend the US dollar as the reserve currency. That was back in 2020. And also we pointed out in there that when he was in the UK, Goldman Sachs, his former employer, where he had been for 13 years, due to certain activities in the UK and Europe, the carbon markets turned around over there and Goldman Sachs made a bundle. So I can't directly pin that on him. It may have had nothing to do with him, but it's interesting that, people with aligned ideologies and who travel in the same circles of, the Davos WEF set and all these other international conferences, obviously they're going to mix and mingle and suggest ideas to people about policy and, make market decisions based on those suggestions.
And it's strange how these people just keep generating billions of dollars in wealth.
Well,
based on these decisions.
Strangest of all, think about carbon accounting. This is, it's buying hot air, literally. It's the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. This is what carbon markets are all about. It's really the emperor's new clothes. But because people have been indoctrinated to fear the potential of a climate crisis, then they think, oh, okay, well, I'll pay a carbon tax, even if it's crippling to me, because I don't want my children to suffer. I don't want to face a big flood next year. Well, flooding is just part of nature. You're not going to stop it by paying a carbon tax. But it's easy to prey on people's minds if they don't know. And most people, I'm sure, do not know that when you're paying in the carbon markets, you're buying the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one.
I think that's the perfect place to cap it. Michelle, that's beautiful. Just a few comments here before we go. A lot of people saw the video of Mark Carney signing his fake executive order to pause the carbon taxes in Canada, but he plans to move those to industry. So brace yourselves, guys, because that carbon tax is coming back, and it's going to come back hard because he's passing it on to industry so that the consumer doesn't necessarily see it. However, those carbon taxes are going to be baked into the prices you pay at the pump. They're going to be baked into the prices you pay on just about everything. And, the silver lining to all of this is that depending on where you are and how you view it, this may or may not be a silver lining, but for me it is. And for Michelle, I'm sure it is for you too, that Alberta is taking the steps towards separating from the Confederacy of Canada. Danielle Smith has reduced the amount of signatures needed in order to trigger a referendum and has extended the time period from 90 days to 120 days. So that means it gives it more time to collect the signatures. But people in Alberta, and for our American listeners, we are basically Canada's Texas. We have had it. We are done. And I think collecting enough signatures in that amount of time is going to be nothing. And we will get a referendum. And whether or not we end up voting to leave, that's a whole other conversation. And maybe, Michelle, you and I can circle back in the future and talk about that and have that discussion. But, BC, in this recent election in Canada, British Columbia, which is historically very far left, not even liberal, but NDP, which is Canada's Socialist Party, BC went conservative in this election. Alberta went conservative, of course, and I want to say 60 to 70% of Saskatchewan went conservative. So these are signs of things to come. There is a wide gap between Western and Eastern Canada right now. And I think the gap now is wide enough that there are going to be some very historical events in the very near future occur in this country. And who knows what that means, whether that means a separate nation formed out of the ashes of what was once Canada, or the 51st state. Who knows? But Michelle, as you just outlined for over an hour here, I don't think we can continue doing this dance. And I think it's time for some drastic actions to be made. And Michelle, thank you again for everything. I love you so much. I'm honestly so I've been very mean to the boomers as of late. And every time I talk about boomers or I post something about boomers, I always pray that I'm not talking about you, because you are one of my favorite people in the world, one of my favorite people to talk to. I am a tremendous fan of everything you do. And when I talk about the boomers that I love to talk to and that I just revere dearly, you are one of three that come into my mind immediately. Michelle, let's talk again real soon. I love these conversations, and yeah, please.
I just do want to say something. That is something that's very troubling to me over this election period, because there is a section of the boomer population who probably are people who had a good government job of some kind. They had defined pensions and, have always had kind of a very stable, comfortable life. And therefore they were able to also maximize whatever finances they had. But there are millions of boomers who are really living on the edge, and I hate to see this societal vengeance rising against boomers in general, when a lot of them are very poor people who they didn't know they were going to live this long. This is the irony of the whole thing, is that if you were back in the 60s and working, you didn't know that you were going to live this long, because back in the 60s, most people who reached their pensionable age died within, 5-7 years after. So after 65, right? But now people are living to be 100. So those people back then didn't know that they had to save up $1 million for their retirement fund, and they didn't do it. They had no concept that they would live that long, or that they would need that kind of money. And most of them were happy if they could just pay off their little house, and that would be like their nest egg, right? And they expected to maybe get a reasonable government pension. Well, today on a government pension, people can barely afford to live. And now everyone's looking at these boomers who have a house, even if it's a modest little house, and going, look at you stole my future. It's like, what, are you kidding? I worked hard all my life. And even if you just worked at the grocery store, think of all the people you contributed to in your community for all those many years. You never got to save up a bunch of money and never got to buy a timeshare in Mexico or whatever these other wealthy boomers are doing. And now you're living on the edge and people are calling you cruel and insensitive toward the youth, when those boomers are the exact opposite. They were very frugal people. They really cared about the planet. They really cared about their community. And now they are living on the edge and, at the food bank. And that's really a travesty.
It is. And I want to clarify while we're on this subject, just before we go, because when I write about this stuff, I make sure that I always write liberal boomers, because
I'm sure there are some poor liberal boomers too.
Oh, I'm positive that there are. And I feel bad generalizing, and maybe I do need to go back and rethink a lot of my perspective on that. Right. What drives me crazy is that, there is a group of the older generation who seem to have found a lot of success in their lives and don't realize or don't care that the world has changed drastically over the last 40 years. Mm-hmm. And I think people in my generation, when we think about boomers, we don't think about the little old lady standing in line at the food bank because her pension doesn't give her enough for groceries and rent, right? Those are the people that I think, at least when I'm referencing boomers, she is not part of that group whatsoever. What we're thinking of is, the people who bought a house for $60,000 in 1984 and now it's worth over $3 million. Who are reveling in the growth of their assets, the astronomical growth of their assets for doing literally nothing, and are continuing to vote for the same policies that are impoverishing and destroying my generation. Those are the people, at least, that I'm referencing. I can't speak for others, but maybe I do need to be more clear when I talk about that, because I have been, I wrote an essay the other day where I talked about boomers, and you came to mind immediately because you're a fucking hero to me. I listened to our episodes together, and just the amount of the encyclopedic knowledge you have living in your brain it breaks my brain to listen to it. And I don't have that stuff living in my head. I'm too dumb for that. So, maybe generalizations aren't fair. And, Michelle, you raise a really good point, and I'm gonna really think about that one, because I didn't think about the little old lady standing in line at the food bank, or the millions of boomers who are struggling.
Yeah, and I mean, that little old lady might be living in a house that if she sold it today on the market, it might be worth $1 million, and it might have been, something she and her husband picked up for like 60,000 years ago. But even if she sold it, she would not end up with like $1 million in her pocket. And there's no place she can buy that's equivalent for that money, right? Yeah. So for many boomers, if they don't have a separate large nest egg, financial nest egg, and other assets, which many of them do, that house is all they have. Mm-hmm. And and all the rising costs of utilities and food and everything, it makes it impossible for them to live. And so it's really cruel that the world is now looking at them and going with envy, like, oh yeah, you own a house. Well, yeah, but I can't afford to maintain it. It needs a new roof. It needs a new water heater, and I'm on like, I don't know, 900, what is it for 800, 900 dollars for pension, that doesn't buy anything. That's so and that's, I think the point is it's I can't remember what author it was, but he was talking about the gulags in the Soviet Union, and he said they say that desperation brings people together. Well, clearly they've never been in a Soviet gulag because it tore everyone apart. And I think maybe that's where we're at right now, is that we're turning each other into the enemy. Yeah.
because we're all in pain and we're all confused and we're all uncertain and anxious about the future. And so I think we're turning our anxiety and our anger on each other because it's the closest enemy in proximity to us. If we all just put our energy together and pointed it in the right direction, we might actually be able to create change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really good point, Michelle. And I'm going to really think about my whole liberal boomer thing in the future, because I think maybe some of my anger might have been a little misguided. But it's confusing times, man.
It is. No, they're very uncertain as well.
Yeah.
I think that level of uncertainty is probably the worst for most people.
Absolutely. I fucking love you, Michelle. I love everything you do. So before you go, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. So you can find Friends of Science Society. We've got lots of reports and all kinds of wonderful books. If you want to actually fight off net zero, you can get this little book from us. You can order it on our website. It's very short, very succinct, but you'll learn how to say no to net zero, and you'll be able to make solid arguments with it. So that's friendsofscience.org. And we're on YouTube, we're on X, we're on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Gab. So
everywhere.
Well, not quite everywhere, but we're quite a few places. And we have lots of reports from Robert Lyman. He's a former federal public servant. He was on the GHG file for about 27 years. He also served as a diplomat for 10 years. So he brings that geopolitical view to many topics as well. And they're all on our blog, and you can find our blog via our website. We also have a youth-oriented website called climatechange101.ca, which is bilingual. We're building up the French side, but we do have quite a bit of information there, and it's kind of a bit more lighthearted and less scientific, more plain language. So, I hope that people will pop in and have a look at our materials. And I really appreciate all that you do, Jason, because, you've been just a powerhouse especially the last few months, all the work you've done with Sam Cooper. Wow, thank you for all those revelations, as terrifying as they are. But you've really given a platform to that information about the infiltration of all these Chinese triad gangs and things we never knew about into the
to be honest, I'm just interested in talking to people that would never talk to me in real life, and that includes you. And so I had to have a podcast to do it. I'd have to have a podcast to do it, and so that's why I'm here. No, I honestly, the Brave New Normal podcast just continues to grow and grow and grow, and now it's in this like snowball phase. But so I couldn't do it without you and Sam and Andy Lee and Brett Weinstein and Naomi Wolf and Robert Malone and all these wonderful people that have given me their time. It's all you guys. Nobody gives a shit about what I have to say. I listen to myself speak on this podcast and I want to kill myself. So,
oh, God forbid. Don't even say that.
But you know what I mean? I honestly, it's all thanks to you guys. And, people listening, if you want to find the links, they're directly below this video or in the description on the audio streamer. But Michelle, I owe it all to you, man. Like our last episode, Mark Carney and the Climate Cartel, tens of thousands of shares. I don't know the total view count, but it just keeps growing every single day. Like literally I go and I check on it every now and then, and it's like, whoa, how did we do this? So that's my long-winded way of saying, Michelle, I owe it to you and to all of the people who've been willing to talk to me here. And let's circle back as this thing develops and you can break my brain with more information.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much. And thanks to all the viewers as well.
Of course.
Thanks for sharing everything, gang.
Thanks, Michelle. And go to the Friends of Science YouTube. Michelle makes the best videos. All right. We'll talk again soon. Okay.
Bye. Bye.